Welcome to Hot Topics in International Trade, brought to you by Braumiller Law Group and Braumiller Consulting Group. Hi, this is Bob Brewer with Braumiller Law Group and Braumiller Consulting Group. Welcome to the podcast. I am joined once again by Robert Stein, our new VP of Braumiller Consulting. Welcome, Robert. We picked another topic for you kids today. We're going to really cover a couple things. We've got two podcasts coming up, one of which that we're going to cover right now is de minimis. And matter of fact, Robert, I just wrote an article on this for the April newsletter, which when I leave this podcast room today, I'm going to publish it just so everyone knows it'll be out there later on today. Now, this de minimis thing is part of my research. This goes back to a tariff act of 1930. Think about it. Great Depression, where de minimis non curat lex, in Latin terms, which pretty much means the law does not concern itself with such trifles.
Right.
Which things of such inconsequential value. Now, granted, this is 1930. So what has happened since then, I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, there was a Trade Facilitation and Enforcement Act in 2016, which brought this de minimis from wherever it was, $200 up to $800.
Correct.
Yep. And the reason that they did this is because it was more of an administrative burden that they were trying to relieve customs of, you know?
Right. I think in 2016, there were some unique pressures, right? This was, e-commerce was a big thing. People were buying things over the internet, were ordering things from overseas and outside the country. At the same time, you had a huge administrative burden to file entries on all these small shipments. And I believe that the change in 2016, the word facilitation is in there, and I like that word. Yeah. It was to facilitate, right? The thought was, well, we don't want to concern ourselves with all these little shipments, grandma's new purse or whatever.
Right.
And I think at the time, certain things were not on the radar that if we could go back in time, I think maybe Congress would have thought about it a little differently. When we think about things like forced labor and we think about things like fentanyl, right, which is coming in, which is really a focus by customs. And so at the time, it seemed like a really great idea. And of course, there were lots of powerful voices that said, yeah, this is great. Organizations that maybe benefited from being able to move cargo more quickly or to be able to sell things in marketplaces. So de minimis really was well-intentioned in the beginning, and certainly in the Facilitation Act to move that value up to $800, that threshold up to $800. Right. I think a lot of people now feel like it's turned into the U.S.-China free trade agreement.
Yeah, it's bad right now. And China, obviously, this always comes to fruition that they're the worst bad actor in this. So
yeah, I mean, there's a lot of things that customs is concerned with, right? The big push right now, forced labor. So I was having a discussion recently with someone, and I said, somebody could have a container load of purses that have cotton in it that are affected by forced labor, and they want to ship it from China, but they can't because if they do, it'll be detained under UFLPA. Yep. But if you take that same container load of purses and you break it up into individual orders and you sell it over Alibaba or Temu or Shein or Amazon Marketplace and you sell them one purse at a time, you can get the entire container load into the U.S. under de minimis to commercial to consumers rather than to commercial organizations. And now it's very difficult for CBP to be able to stop it the way they would a container load.
Right.
So this is a big thing. I know customs is very aggressively looking at ways to collect more data, changing the way the data pilot works for Type 86 entry in Section 321 to try to get more data in time to stop packages when they do come through, whether it's a courier hub. I don't know what they're doing with mail, because I think mail is a real problem. And just to be very clear, right, the focus here is forced labor and very aggressively fentanyl.
Yeah.
Customs talks about this. Congress talks about this. And you always have to be careful, because in these discussions, when we talk about things like, oh, well, this is really great. If you support too much of this coming in, it is often seen or interpreted as, supporting these types of illegal importations. And by no means do we support that. I believe that there needs to be more data collection. There needs to be something done. And I know you're probably going to lead into this is like, what are the things that could be done about de minimis to try to rectify it? Did I jump ahead?
No, because obviously, okay, so here we stand with I can pronounce his name correctly, I think. Blumenauer, Brown, Rubio, they've introduced this Import Security and Fairness Act. So really what you're talking about is they're banned shipments from countries on our priority watch list. Well, it's China.
Right.
I mean, if you like what you mentioned, is it change? I mean, you look at what leveling the playing field, even from an economic standpoint. I mean, they're not playing fairly. Obviously, they paid 0 tariffs, I think, in 2023, and they're because one of the bigger fashion industry. All right, Gap played by the rules. Shane paid 0. Gap paid $700 million.
Right.
How is that fair? It's not. Even when you look at Amazon from an e-commerce standpoint, I mean, 40% is coming in from China. How is that fair to U.S. based?
Right.
It's not.
It's not fair. And the problem is that the legislative will to actually fix this, it's very tricky, right? So I was just at the CBP Trade Summit in Philadelphia. Yeah. And there was lots of talk about what are the solutions to this de minimis issue. And there's talk about changing de minimis. One of the conversations was about in Congress the possibility of reducing the threshold again, bringing it back, maybe not to 200, but to some lower value. The other alternative was to do that, but to index it to the de minimis threshold in each country. So in other words, where one country has a $50 de minimis and one has a $200, to use that as an index and maybe add a value like $200 to it, which is incredibly complicated, right? Although well-intentioned, right? We call that reciprocal de minimis. And then the last one is really to sort of take the knives out and sharpen them for China, which this is an election year. And so that's a very popular thing. Whoever gets elected in November, we're going to see the knives out for China.
Oh, absolutely.
And I believe, at least from a legislative standpoint, that the most likely scenario is that de minimis will get more complicated and difficult for China following the election, because that is the most likely course of legislative action, in my opinion.
Yeah, right? Yeah. Well, those on the other side of the coin would say if you do that, if you bring that down, it's going to raise the prices back up for those consumers.
Well, yes, I'm not in charge of the price.
I know.
But when we talk about unfair trade,
right,
to be completely honest about it, yes, when there's unfair trade, people are getting access to goods that are a lot less expensive than they would be because it's getting in unfairly. So when you say the prices will go up 100%, just the same as when tariffs were added, the prices went up. The bad players will continue to find those avenues to evade. And that's really the issue. So when you say, well, let's lower the threshold for de minimis, do we really think that the bad players are going to do anything but lower the values on their shipments to whatever?
They're just going to find a way around it. I mean, there are companies out there, you and I both know as we sit here this morning, that are shipping in bulk to warehouses, breaking this up. And then obviously it's the, one person per 1 day package. And it's working for them that way too.
Well, let's talk about that, because there's a real economic impact to U.S. business. We have the situation where, U.S. businesses want to bring stuff in, but then they're competing in a market where they want to have the lowest duties. And if they're going to compete with the Alibabas and the Temus and everything, they need to get their goods in duty free. So instead of putting distribution warehouses in the U.S., in some cases, they're putting them in places like Canada and Mexico. And now they can bring those packages in. They can do those retail sales to U.S. consumers under de minimis and get the same benefit. So what does that mean economically? Well, that warehouse should really be in the U.S. Those jobs should be in the U.S. Those taxes being paid by that business and those employees should be in the U.S. We are literally taking money out of our economy because de minimis, in essence, promotes the placement of warehouses outside the U.S. and the use of de minimis to get them in.
Yeah, I mean, I'm going back to my article in my head. I think it was like 485 million de minimis packages alone in 2023 they came across. It's unbelievable now what it's costing us, and just in tariffs, left there on the table. And I'm going back to in my head. I think what Europe's like USD 190 in de minimis, but it varies by country. I think Canada was around 20. I mean, China was like $7.90 US de minimis. China. And I'm like, oh my God. So let's take a huge look at this, obviously, through this new bill. And do you think that's actually going to go anywhere, though, the bill, anytime soon?
It's an election year, so I don't think anything's going anywhere. Most of what's going through Congress right now, again, opinion, is a lot of posturing, a lot of demonstrating for an electoral purpose what the focus will be to protect, whether it's U.S. workers or U.S. business, industry, etc. I think the real action will take place following the election. Again, whoever wins, there'll be a concerted effort to defend the economy, the commerce of the U.S. I don't think whether you're a Democrat or a Republican, it matters. At the end of the day, we want to protect U.S. businesses. We want to protect U.S. jobs, but we need to be careful because it's very easy to slip into protectionism, which then doesn't benefit anyone. So there's a very delicate balance here, right? You don't make these changes in a void. And every time you make a change, it has ramifications to global trade and the U.S. position within the global economy. We can't just withdraw into a corner and be isolated. We tried that way back before the Great Depression hit. Yeah. And that worked out very poorly. I think there continues to be a careful balance of what is best for the economy, what is best for the consumer, but also what is best for the individual worker.
But in the meantime, as you say this, we've got another 8-9 months, maybe another year of this abuse.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think that's problematic, and without saying too much, I think it would be fair to say there's a fair amount of paralysis in Washington, D.C. Yeah. So an election by no means guarantees action on these fronts, but I do believe of all the topics that Congress is trying to work together on, I believe trade is one where there is some unity. There's some disagreements about some of the specifics. We've seen GSP renewal drag out for over 3 years. There's talk about non-renewal of AGOA and things like that. But I believe that most of the politicians are anxious to find solutions. Yes, they want to find ways to facilitate legitimate trade. But there is a concern, and I think right now the danger that I see is more that there's such a focus on enforcement, there's such a focus on fentanyl and forced labor, that I think there's a danger that we may be losing sight of the fact that we need to facilitate legitimate trade. We need to facilitate trade that has benefits to us as Americans. We like flat screen TVs that cost $500. Nobody likes to spend $2,000-$3,000 for a TV that they could get for $500. But we have to find that happy medium where we can trade with partners who trade fairly and ethically, don't traffic in forced labor, don't move drugs like fentanyl into our economy. And there's no easy answers. I think data is going to be helpful. Yeah. I think we need to be careful because data is not a magic bullet either, because bad players will find ways to manipulate data, hide data. But I think in the end, customs needs more data. We need to have the capability of getting some information. These packages that come in under de minimis, there's so little information.
Yes, there is. But bad actors are always going to be there. Always. Present. China is always going to be there on the top of our watch list. It goes without saying. If Trump gets reelected, he wants to go to 600% tariff or something like that. Look out if that happens.
Well, the law of unintended consequences says that if you raise tariffs that high, all you will do is incentivize the circumvention of those mechanisms. In reality, mechanisms that are equitable and fair and not unreasonable don't promote circumvention. So let's be honest, the 25% tariffs that went into effect against China have had little impact. And most companies have accounted for that in their cost and to the consumers and reducing other costs in their production. So that has had little impact. But when it comes to things like forced labor and UFLPA, we've seen a lot of efforts by China to circumvent that. Why? Yeah. Because that means they can't get those goods out of China. So what are they doing? They're pushing things through other countries, Vietnam, Thailand, Cambodia, Singapore. So I think that, again, de minimis is something where I think we need to focus more on how can we help U.S. businesses regain some of the lost volumes that are going outside the U.S., where people are buying direct from overseas and benefiting those economies? How do we get more control over it? So I think some of the activity by NAFTZ with efforts to allow de minimis through foreign trade zones, because what could be better? Wouldn't you rather, as customs and as consumers, have all these packages sitting in a warehouse in the U.S. that's carefully controlled under U.S. customs supervision?
Exactly.
Where if customs wants to go in and inspect things before they're even withdrawn and sent to consumers, that they can see that? Or would you rather have it come direct from China or go through a third-party warehouse in a third country? And these are questions that we need answers to.
Absolutely. Well, Robert, I like to keep these, as you know, to 15 minutes. Our 15 minutes is up. Catch our next podcast. We're going to cover this huge collapse, this bridge collapse, on our next one here. But thanks for joining us, everyone. See you next time.